Hello, and welcome to podcast, whatever number it is. I'm back with this. This is a bit of an odd episode because I'm back with myself because this podcast is not to be self-centered, but seems to be a little bit about me. There's been a lot of people that have been asking. I've been asking a lot of questions over the course of these podcasts. There's been a lot of stuff going on with me, and I've dealt with the news section of the podcast pretty incompetently. So we got a professional in the shape of Ben Nichols, who you've heard from on previous podcasts, and he's basically just going to grill me for a little bit and see where it comes to. So
grill being the operative word.
So Ben and I have worked together on a whole bunch of projects over the years. Years?
Yeah, it feels like longer.
Yeah, it feels like longer.
In the nicest possible way.
Actually, you couldn't find probably a better person that's been with me on this journey since I've retired. So he's got a few tricky questions up his sleeve, I'm sure. So kick it off, Ben, if you wish.
Oh, thanks for having me as the cameo interviewer, Callum, today. Yeah, like you say, you're often speaking to others, but you've got a lot going on in your own professional life, and I think people will be interested to know what you're doing these days. Obviously, you had the sort of pinnacle of your career at Rio. Incredible accomplishments there. Tell us a little bit about what's been happening since, and then perhaps up to the current day, what you're wearing, what hats you're wearing today.
Yeah, so I guess after Rio, I felt like I felt there was a bit of a void in my life. I guess I think the Olympics is a perfect. I've always said it's like the perfect distraction. Whatever was going on with your life, you kind of had this reason to just push on, suppress, and continue because you were so focused on that all-encompassing goal. And when people used to say to you like a year before the Olympics, "Oh, you must be training hard," and you're like, "You don't understand. It's pretty much been a 10-year process." Like when we were on the junior squad, we had 2 of the 5 Olympic rings on our T-shirt, and the idea was you're going to build up. And it was always the mentality of British cycling that literally nothing else matters besides the Olympic Games. That's what we want to see you do well in. That's where our funding's based off. So then to go to Rio, turn a 6th at the World Championships before into a 1st place, beating the world champions, pick up an Olympic record with 2 of my best mates on the top step of the podium. At that point, it just felt like kind of mission accomplished. And then all of a sudden, I lost that ultimate distraction, I guess. So I kind of treaded water for a little while. Had mixed success, picked up the odd World Cup win, picked up a bronze medal at the Commonwealth Games. But it just became clear that, my heart maybe wasn't in it as much as it was before. Like my heart was still in cycling, but it wasn't necessarily in competitive cycling. Yeah. And I always kind of took pride around the velodrome thinking, I want this more than anyone else. Like I'm not a dick about it. I'm not like, messing up with anyone's gear or kit or anything like that. Like I'm not taking it to a militant level, but I want this more than anyone. Yeah. And I'm unstoppable in this kind of pursuit of gold, I guess. So then I guess it took about 2 years to kind of actually properly come to terms with that. I had some mental health battles along the way. And then the door of doing something else was kind of ajar, I guess. I was on the UK Anti-Doping Athletes Committee, and then through a lot of that kind of volunteer activism, got involved with what's now Global Athlete and things like that. And it's in terms of like a voluntary situation, it's something that I've found a real passion for, is giving something back to the sport in general, which is like Olympic sport. I love cycling, and trying to boost that athlete voice, because I think all too often it seems a little bit neglected, I guess, and that's not in a us and them kind of we're not pushing forward hopefully with a either of conflict where they're trying to collaborate and hopefully support improvements in sport, because it's a competitive place. And I think a lot of the time the athletes have a really good idea of where they want to see the sport to go, but they're just not always engaged. I think the idea of thinking that an athlete is just a physical asset or a performer is kind of drifting into the distance. And what's more, I don't think it's competitive anymore. So to try and give something back in that context, I think feels like quite a good thing to do. So that's been kind of one of my major focuses in the last couple months.
We'll come on to a little bit more about what you're doing now, but you just touched on something there with the athlete activism hat about sort of giving back to the sport. I think that's something you hear a lot of, whether it's in interviews or just commentary and articles about sport. You hear a lot about athletes being driven by that, particularly in the latter stages of their career where they're thinking about what lies next over the hill, as it were. For you, has it, did you go through your career, was there any kind of sense of looking forwards thinking, I want to give back to my sport. I'm interested in how I can change sport or work with the administrators and change it for the better? Or did that only come about, at the tail end of your career when you announced your retirement, really?
I mean, in terms of being interested in sports governance, I think the psychology of an athlete is always one of acceptance. And the idea, especially in British cycling, was you're never going to be able to change the rules. So what you can control is how you adapt to the rule. And if you adapt to it better than your opposition, you're going to be in a better place. And like, to illustrate my kind of lack of interest in sports governance, like, by the time I went to Rio, I really had zero interest in it at all. Like, I probably might have been able to tell you the name of the president of the IOC, and that would be about it. Didn't know anything about the procedures or the sliding doors and mirrors that I found out now. And from a kind of selfish point of view, I always felt, I think there's an element of sports people trying to not kid themselves, because I know there's a lot of people who think they give back through delivering amazing performances, but from a personal point of view, I almost felt as if it was quite a selfish pursuit. It was always about making yourself faster. It was always about taking as many resources as you possibly could and applying them to yourself to make yourself better. And from that point of view, from just as a person, that's where I started to feel as if I wanted to give something back, I guess.
And on that athlete activism sort of theme, that we're talking about it here like it's something developing in Olympic and Paralympic sport, but of course across the pond in the States and the professional leagues world, they'll be like, "What's news, guys? This has been around for ages, and you've got a very unionized sporting culture where athlete rights are embedded in the process. It's not sort of that you get to the end of a decision, a new policy from the governing body, and suddenly there's an uproar from the athletes. They have the unions, there's collective bargaining. It's part of the process there. Why do you think we're lagging so far behind in kind of what we call Olympic or Paralympic sport? Why is there now this sort of friction where athletes are feeling, hang on, these rules don't represent me in the best light, and I know because I'm the one competing? Why are we facing this now? It's 2019. We're very far on in the modern world now.
I guess my take on it is that professional sport in the US has pretty much always been professional, and in Europe, we've by the late 80s, that the age of amateurism in Olympic sport had pretty much died out. You had the Eastern nations, the previously communist nations, and a few others that were always pretty much professional. They just kind of worked around the rules. But in the UK and things like that, it was 100% kind of amateur. I remember hearing stories from guys in the team where like they had to, sign out a skin suit and then sign it back in after an event. And you compare that to today when we're given like 120 different pieces of kit that we're pretty much allowed to keep afterwards. We're all paid to go full time. We're all expected to, pretty much drop everything else and give as much as we can to the sport in return for that money. And that professionalism element that's crept into Olympic sport is probably why we started to see a bit of an awakening. And I think in a way, a lot of the European federations especially are kind of lagging behind in that idea of sport being pure and amateuristic in that sense, and that the pride of competing for your country and competing in your sport is enough. And in many ways it is. I think it is, and it is really special. But I think when you start to see the amount of money that's now involved in Olympic sport, I think that leads to a whole bunch of natural questions as to where is it going and why don't we get a single penny of it, I guess, directly. I know the IOC put a lot of money into ensuring that a lot of smaller nations get to come to the Olympic Games and things like that, but it just seems it doesn't seem as transparent as I would have liked. And with professional sport in the US, there was a long, hard slog where people were striking and all that kind of stuff until they got their athlete rights. Yeah. I personally wouldn't like to see us get to that stage. I think that would be quite damaging for Olympic sport, but I think there's more wiggle room in there than is currently being let on at the moment.
So it can be more of a hand-in-hand approach.
Absolutely.
Before you have to get to the strike, the divisiveness, you don't need to get there because the noise is already being made. So, you're saying let's sit around and discuss these and try and come to an amicable solution.
Absolutely, and I'm known for being a bit of a provocateur, for better or worse, I guess. But I don't really see why a lot of people end up taking this so personally. Maybe it's an ego thing or something else, but genuinely my interactions with these bodies, which I consider to be antiquated, is one of collaboration. I'm saying you've got an amazing asset that you're not using. Sport's a competitive place. You've got the birth of esports, the birth of the X Games, the birth of extreme sports and things like that. It's a competitive landscape, and I want to see Olympic sport and Paralympic sport survive for the next 100 years and the next 100 years after that. And what I'm saying is that the athletes have a lot of the answers. You're just not speaking to them.
Yeah, we don't want to dive too far into sports governance. It's quite a niche topic, but there is one aspect that I think, Rule 40, which is an Olympic rule, which those who follow Olympic sport might be aware of. Certainly, the athletes are aware of. But I think the public would be interested in knowing a little bit more. Okay, what is this, and why does it affect athletes? We're hearing a lot about how it impacts or can dent an athlete's commercial or marketing prospects, and how it's kind of outdated rule. Tell us about what the rule means from an athlete perspective, and why is there a groundswell now to change it?
So basically, Rule 40 kind of restricts your personal rights as an athlete to promote your own sponsors. So it differs from country to country, but the situation as it stands in the UK is that for a week before, the 2 weeks during, and a week after, you aren't allowed to tweet, promote, and I'm talking to the point where your personal sponsor can't even use the term summer in a tweet during that time. They can't use any photos or anything like that. You basically just can't, for those 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you don't have any personal sponsors. And that's, of course, the time where we want to capitalize on it the most. And
that's
that
sort of your moment in the sun, really.
It is, absolutely. And that really limits our earning potential sometimes. And I think that's why athletes are starting to kind of question that rule a little bit more, as in, why can't I use a photo of me with the Olympic rings in the background promoting my personal sponsor? I can for all the other years previous and years after. Why is it so restricted in games time? And also, I think there's a lot of really good stories that come out of that. I was sponsored by a fairly small, it was like a Scottish national surveying company, and they backed me through pretty much my whole Olympic journey. Now they're not competing with the likes of Allianz or Coca-Cola or anything like that. So personally, from a commercial point of view, I can't see them getting too upset that they're losing exclusivity when it comes to a Scottish national surveying firm. But that's an example of one of the good stories as well. And athletes are, on the whole, quite grateful for their sponsors. They want to be able to promote the story, and just give the public a bit more of an eye into what it's actually like to be an athlete. So it limits your ability to kind of story tell and kind of make money as well. But as I said, I think there's a lot of give and take going forward. I'm not saying let's abolish Rule 40. I'm saying let's find where the wiggle room is. Maybe if it's in the UK we're quite good at categorizing small and medium and large businesses. Maybe if that rule was eroded for small businesses, which I think is a company that's got less than 150 employees or something like that, that'd be a good step forward. Yeah. Because they're not going after any of the big sponsors. They're small, and they're pretty much they're not going to expand to being the size of Coca-Cola overnight.
Yeah.
And that's where I see there being wiggle room in there, and also the ability for athletes to create their own content. We're always criticised in British cycling for not showing our personalities. We're seen as robotic and criticised for that a lot of the time as well. If we were allowed to vlog within the games, do podcasts within the games, take photos in the venues, film in the venues, all that kind of stuff, I can't see that as being anything but for the betterment of the sport.
Yeah.
So from either from a story point of view or a commercial point of view, I think that's where there needs to be a little bit of reform.
Changing tack, you alluded to, since Rio, facing your own kind of challenges with mental health, and you've talked about that in the media already. But just tell us a little bit about what that was like to go through, and how you've overcome that.
I'd say I've been quite sensitive with how much I want to reveal to the media. I'd say probably about 10% of the story is actually out there at the moment. I'm always about trying to convey a story which is digestible to the public and something that will impact real change. And I know that mental health, maybe some people are getting a little bit desensitized to it, because it seems like every week there's an athlete coming out with an issue with mental health, but it is a genuine problem. There was a suicide within the UK sports system a couple of weeks ago with a judo athlete. A couple months before that with a snowboard athlete. And I think ultimately you're dealing with athletes that are quite vulnerable. I think it's quite easy to put them on a pedestal and say they're invincible. But ultimately athletes can be some of the most insecure people you'll ever meet. And that's basically because they're judged by their last performance. And quite often that can be a relentless treadmill, and especially in cycling where it's so measurable. You're reminded sometimes 20 times a day that you're not where you should be. And if you're in the wrong frame of mind, that can become quite destructive. It can become to the point where you think, I'm shit at this, I guess, or I'm worthless because I've based all my self-value on a sporting achievement. So that's why I kind of thought it was right to talk about it in the media. And hopefully it leads to real change. I think, it goes back to that point where I feel like athletes are maybe a little bit undervalued in sport from commercial or creating their own content. It applies to mental health as well. And it's not that these issues were never there. I think it's good that people are speaking about it more, and we're making progress in the UK. The suicide rate amongst young men is going down, probably illustrative of the fact that we are talking about it more. So I think that's a good thing. But yeah, no, it was a real struggle, and probably if I had to equate it to anything, I'd say it was a harder challenge than any injury or making the Olympic Games. It was trying to get over this mental health issue, and it takes a lot of fighting. I mean, personally, I went through, probably about 6 therapists, 2 psychiatrists, until I ended up working with Steve Peters, and that ended up being the magic formula, and I got better. But maybe if I had a bit of early intervention, I might still be doing cycling now. It's difficult to answer that question. But I think that's something that we need to bear in mind when we see athletes, is that they're not as invincible as everyone might think.
Yeah. Looking now to what you're doing today, you said you've got several hats. You're wearing many hats. Tell us about those hats and what you're focused on today, and then we can talk a little bit about the future as well.
Yeah, so I work for a few different companies. I'm a freelancer, as wanky as that sounds. So I work for Science and Sport 2 days a week, who are basically my nutrition partner through my whole career, and they produce supplements which are tested for banned substances. All of them are. So that fits in really well with a lot of the work I do for anti-doping work, and I basically work in a marketing role with them to promote how safe their products are. I also work for a small titanium bike company called Valu, which are based down south, and that's again kind of like a marketing role, just trying to pull on my network, pull on my communications to, I guess, sell more bikes and improve the image and the brand value of the company. Volunteer stuff, I'm still on the British Athletes Commission, the British Olympic Association's Athlete Commission, still on the UK Anti-Doping Athletes Commission, and lead athlete with Global Athlete, which is a organisation which is, I guess at the moment it sits in kind of like a pressure group. I guess it's a group which asks all the questions that maybe athletes are a little bit too aren't confident enough to voice as an individual. We go out there, we ask questions, we pose challenging opportunities to see about the change in sports governance, I guess. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Still doing a bit of sponsor work here and there. Did some stuff with Morgan Stanley last week. Still do bits and pieces with Temper, Triumph motorbikes, all that kind of stuff. So it's a real broad church, and then if anything, that's been the real attraction of what I'm doing now, is that when you were based in Manchester on the cycling team, it's quite a monotonous, or can be quite monotonous landscape.
Yeah. Quite one-dimensional.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we don't have the choice to change teams. I'm British and I can't change to any other nations, so I have to go through the same process all over again. So to be away from home for 3 weeks in the month in a different hotel room every single night, moving around the country, seeing different people, speaking to different clients, doing the podcast and things like that has been an amazing opportunity. And it's been a real kind of contrast, but a real exciting contrast to my kind of previous career, I guess.
And talk a little bit about, during the time since you've finished cycling, you've had some pretty good experiences. So one, where we met was at the White House for the sort of emergency anti-doping summit.
That was pretty surreal.
There's not many times when anti-doping reaches the pinnacles of the White House. So tell us a little bit about that and what sort of opportunity that gave you to voice your opinions.
I think that's the kind of thing, and those opportunities that that started to be presented towards me are all kinds of things that I would never be able to do as an athlete. Like I couldn't take a week off and go to Washington DC, deliver a speech at the White House when I was an athlete. I couldn't, and then I went on from there to New Zealand to help my brother set up as he was moving out there. But no, it's those kind of things that you kind of have to pinch yourself, and it also gives you real worth outside of sport, I guess. There's not many people who are kind of presented with that situation. And the White House was a crazy place. I remember, like, depending on your security level, you were either A, allowed to go to the toilet by yourself, or B, not allowed to go to the toilet by yourself. If you're a US citizen, you're allowed to go by yourself, and if you weren't, if you're like some kind of foreign renegade like we were, you had to be escorted to the toilet, and there's all these like sniffer dogs and all this kind of stuff. It was
must have avoided that then.
It was. Did you know? It was totally surreal, and I know I make no bones about not being a massive fan of Trump, but respecting the office and respecting the House is something else. And I felt as if it was too good an opportunity to turn down.
Yeah, well, hopefully there'll be many more of those. And looking to the future, if you can have that crystal ball moment, where in 10, 15, 20 years' time, where do you see yourself? You president of the IOC?
I had an absolute shocker that you were on that panel with me when I was at the iSport conference, and Rob Hoodhouse, who was an Australian swimmer, now an agent for
strong athlete reform candidate.
Yeah, he is. He said, "Oh, maybe we'll see you as president of the IOC in 10, 20 years," and I immediately just went, "Oh God, no, please, anything but." But maybe there's more of a place for that in sports governance. Maybe there's more of a place for people who take up the position not because they want it themselves, but because other people are saying that you'd be good at it. People say the same thing about politics. There's too many big personalities and too many big egos, and maybe there's a really good place for people with a solid value base who really want to impact real change. I think the current president, Thomas Bach, kind of started on that path in a really genuine and authentic way, and maybe slowly we've it seems like the Olympic movement has kind of lost that way a little bit. And as I said, going back to my earlier answer, the Olympics cycling is something that I'm so heavily invested in and I want to see succeed. So I guess if people thought I'd be okay at that job, I'd give it a shot. But at the moment, I'm really happy exploring opportunities mainly in the commercial world, and then also being kind of a vocal voice on the outskirts and encouraging athletes to find their voice within that as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, there's plenty of opportunities in the future, no doubt. Great, Callum. That's been a lot of fun. Thanks for talking.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for taking up the interviewer angle. It feels I feel under a lot more pressure than when I normally do these podcasts. Usually
it's uncomfortable, isn't it?
I just sit back, throwing the grenade, and see what happens. Basically,
tables have turned.
Exactly. No, thank you very much, Ben. And we'll be back next week. We've got James Haskell lined up on the podcast coming up. Hopefully, Joe Clark again. Phil will be back. And so stay tuned in the coming weeks. I don't feel as if we always ask our guests to plug their Instagram and Twitter, but I feel like if you're listening to this, you probably all know where I am anyway, so I won't do that. And maybe we'll do this with Phil actually in the future. We'll try and eke some blood out of that stone and see what he's got to say. So yeah, tune in next week, and thanks Ben for asking some questions.
Thanks.